Record this, Laura. Welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Ritchie, the Executive Director of the Northwest Cider Association. I am really excited to be here today and to welcome Greg Peck. He's the Associate Professor at the School of Integrative Plant Science in the Horticulture section at Cornell University. He's beaming in from sabbatical. He's come to chat with us, which is so nice of him. And just briefly, an introduction for him. Not only do I see him annually at CiderCon, regularly at events, and he's a wealth of knowledge about cider apples, but his research is focused on cider apples, which is very unusual. There's not a lot of folks like this guy. His research addresses the challenges of sustainability and profitability producing tree fruit. He did study in Washington at WSU, so he's got some nice ties to the Pacific Northwest. He's also researched in California and now in New York. More specifically, his research covers many different aspects of tree fruit production, including identifying cider apple germplasm, developing horticulture practices that improve hard cider quality, sustainable soil and nutrient management practices, increasing the efficiency of organic apple orchard production systems, and improving crop load management in apple trees. So the common thread among this research is really the development of fruit production systems that facilitate the long-term economic and environmental viability of commercial tree fruit. This idea to have him beam in for us today really came when Greg was visiting Washington cideries earlier this summer. And he's going to talk about what he saw on that visit and how it compares to his research in upstate New York. He has asked you to come with plenty of questions. He wants to have this be a nice, intimate conversation with you all. So feel free to turn on your cameras if you're comfortable, or just throw questions in the chat. But Greg, take it away. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Emily. Really appreciate that. And please introduce yourselves in the chat. And we're a small group, and you can put in questions into the chat. What happens in Zoom is when I go to full screen mode, I don't see as many of the features. I don't see the video or the chat as well. So you can just unmute yourself and interject if you have a question, or you can hold it till the end. I figure I've got about 35 to 40 minutes, depending if we get some questions, of material, just kind of giving you a brief overview of some of the work that we're doing here at Cornell. And then I wanted really the rest of the time to be more interactive and discussion oriented, and just kind of hear what questions you have. And that's why I kind of have this prompt early on, just to start your brains moving, like, what did you come here to learn? And let's try to see if we can answer some of those questions or have some discussions. Of course, I'm based in Ithaca, New York, and so my climate is very different. We're a temperate climate. We have real winters here. The Pacific Northwest is really broad. It's a big geographic region. So I know some of you, Washington and Puget Sound, into Idaho, Montana, down into Oregon. You guys range from really arid conditions to some really rainy, really maritime climates that are, probably more similar to some of the European climates than anything that we see in upstate New York. So definitely want to, especially when we get to the question and answer, lean in on everybody else's knowledge too about what you're seeing in your region. So I'm going to move this into full screen mode. Laura, the sound's good and the full screen's good?
Yeah, it looks good.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so move the chat box over here. I'm just going to move some things around. Great. Emily did a really nice job summarizing some of my research. Just some of the other areas I work on are in soil health, crop load management, particularly with bloom thinning. Probably these days, something like 70, 80% of my research program is focused on growing cider apples. And the work that I do is I'm a horticulturalist, so I'm on the plant side of the equation. And the work is really parallel to what viticulturalists have been doing for centuries for wine grapes, right? So how do we improve the quality of the final product by how we're growing the crop? So the viticulturists ask lots of questions about what's the balance between how many leaves to how many fruit clusters, how much nitrogen do we need? What happens if we restrict or, the water use? Just lots of questions about the physiology of the plant. A lot of information that ends up making its way into the wine bottle, but not necessarily is always the flashiest part of the industry. And that's where I decided to work because I just love plants. And so I'm going to just give you some highlights of some of the work that we've been doing. But before I do that, as Emily said, a little bit of what Greg did on his summer vacation. So in June, I was at a conference in Wenatchee on mineral nutrition for tree fruit crops. And so before that conference, I contacted my good friend and colleague, Carol Miles, who's here on the bottom left of the screen, and her graduate student, Seth Bronner from WSU. And I said, hey, I'd love to come visit, see what you guys are up to. It's been a long time since I've been out that way. And so they set up a nice little tour, and I got to visit some of the producers in the Puget Sound area, both north and south of Seattle. So this is the research farm that Carol works at in Mount Vernon. They have this really cool espaliered welcome that they spelled out with trees. And then this is what Carol's research trees look like. These are her cider apple trees in what I would call a semi-intensive management system. Not the most widely, not the most intensely planted, and certainly I'll show you some pictures of what they do more towards the center of the state in terms of high density production. This is the mechanical harvester. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with Carol's research. This is the one that she's using, Corban. It's a berry harvester, and this one I think was adapted for cherry production, for mechanical harvested cherries, and now they're using it on cider apples, and they have these fingers here that knock the fruit off, gets caught on these belts here, and then on the either side of these. Let's see if I can get the little doodad here, laser pointer. These things here is where the fruit will come out and then drop into a bin. She's using a hedger, so really kind of looking towards the mechanized cider apple production for the future. Visited Dave over at Alma Cider, really close to Carol. Looked at some of his plantings, kind of low input towards organic, lots of traditional varieties, lots of different product types, really nice labels, Dave. I love those. We went up to visit Melinda Rylands. Chris was actually you guys had an event that day in Portland. I think he had a big award, and they had won an award, so Chris wasn't there. So Melinda showed us around their orchards, much, even lower input, low intensive orchard for them, really kind of leaning into a system of regenerative agriculture and, running into some successes and some challenges with that. I love their labels. Their labels are totally like for the geek, which I am, of course, and they have like all this data on their labels, some of their single variety labels, talking about the chemical constituents, and in the back, there's a whole like description of the variety, the cider, and the fermentation notes. It's like reading a little mini master's thesis for every one of those we tasted. And we tasted quite a few. It's really fun to taste single variety ciders just to kind of learn about the different varieties. South of Seattle, we visited Cockrell Farms, and Rich showed us around there. U-pick operation, higher density, really sandy soils, irrigating, and trying to, as much as he can, just do estate grown fruit. And that was also true of the previous two producers. Also using this mechanical harvester from time to time. It's got these, runs on a small, like kind of riding mower type of engine, and then has this drum on the back that has spikes, and the spikes roll over the apples, puncture the apple, but then the apple gets picked up and then gets put into a bin. So a way of mechanically harvesting for very cheap. Also visited one of the biggest producers in the country, Schilling. No pictures in the inside, but that was just mind-boggling to see the scale of production that's happening in your region. They're using a lot of fruit from Central Washington, some high tannin fruit even, and Colin rather was very interested in trying to expand that. So it was really interesting. Super high tech, total geeked out operation. It was pretty amazing. If you're into engineering, try to get a tour of that. Then after visiting Carol, I went over to the other side of the mountain and visited with Craig Campbell and Marcus. And this is their operation, Tietin. Marcus does the fermentation. Craig is the grower, and super high density. This is very similar to his production systems that he's doing for his fresh market as well. So he's just kind of figures apples are apples. I'm going to grow my high tannin specialty apples same way I do my culinary apples, so it fits into my system, my equipment, my crew's know-how, etc. But also in that process, had to do a lot of variety screening to get to find varieties that really made sense for that kind of system. Not every variety that he started growing actually works in this kind of system. And so we had a lot of discussions around that. Also popped up to a little bit north of Wenatchee, Lake Chelan, and visited with probably what's the first genetically engineered cider in the country, maybe the world, I don't know. But these guys are using the Arctic apples to make a cider for, brand identification, maybe excess fruit, a whole bunch of things. You can see the ciders clarify really well because it doesn't have the polyphenol oxidase, the enzyme that causes browning in apples. So it's missing that enzyme, and that's what they genetically engineered in these Arctic apples. And so that was pretty fascinating. Oh, I didn't finish the slide, but I also got a chance to visit Watercore, and even the Chamber of Commerce in Wenatchee has an amazing cider lineup. It was I spent about an hour and a half in there just drinking through their cider. Okay, so that's a bit of what I did my summer vacation, and I've traveled a lot over the world too. I was in Spain this summer. I was in Poland, Germany. Just as a reminder, when we look at a very macro scale of where we are, the US is the 5th largest producer. UK, of course, is number 1. If you add up 2, 3, 4, and 5, it still doesn't equal number 1. South Africa is largely contributed to just 1 producer. Same in Sweden. And so it's really in the US that we start seeing a lot more diversity in terms of the type of products that are called cider. After the UK, right? We have big producers there, and then we kind of a little bit of a resurgence there, but they're big producers are ahead of us. Their small scale producers are still growing in numbers, where I feel like they were like, hey, look at what's happened in the States. We should, people started getting interested in making smaller scale, getting into the business at a smaller scale than the Bulmers or the Thatchers, et cetera. Cidercraft put out this stat last year, just showing the growth of our industry over time. I really started doing a lot of my cider research in 2011, 2012. And at the time I was working at Virginia Tech, and I started getting calls from our apple growers there who were saying, hey, this cider producer wants me to plant this, variety I never heard of. What do you know about it? Is this worthwhile? Is this, a good use of my land, my time, my money? So first thing we started doing over 10 years ago now was doing a lot of cost of production studies. A lot of those are still available online, and I don't know if I'll talk about them very much today, but I can share links to those. And we also have some really nice Excel workbooks that we've made over time that allow you to put in your own input costs. how many trees per acre? What's your trellis post cost? What's your irrigation cost? How much does it cost for you for pest control, for weed control, et cetera? What are your yields? What is your price per pound or price per bin or whatever unit you're using? And it'll give you some breakdown of the profitability of your orchard. So I can share those tools with you too if people are interested. So we're over 1,300 cider producers in the States right now. It's great. It's kind of a bit plateauing, but still some growth, and it'll be interesting to see. I mean, this is kind of the point in an emerging industry where we start seeing turnover, we start seeing consolidation, we start seeing people who were seemingly having really successful businesses move out. They've kind of done it and they've moved on, and then kind of a new entry level. So this has happened with craft beer. And this happened in the early 90s, and they kind of went through this big boom, and then there was kind of a bit of a decrease, and now they're back up again and the industry is a lot more sophisticated and organized now. And we'll see what happens. We can learn a lot from the craft beer industry over the time. Washington, you guys are the #1 producer of apples in the country. 45% of all apples are grown out there. We do about 12% in New York. Little bit of production for fresh market in Oregon, not as much in Idaho and Montana, of course, but little bits down near the Parma Research Station. There's some apple production there. But what's always interesting is to overlay where are the apples to where are the cideries. And so this is Cider Guide. It's kind of, I think it might be a couple of years outdated, but it shows a really nice picture that even though most for Washington and the Pacific Northwest, apples are grown in the Yakima Valley, Central Washington, Wenatchee, the cideries are in the Puget Sound, right, and along the coast. And so there's some central, right? There's some that we visited, Titan and a couple in Wenatchee, but coastal. So there's a real disconnect in some ways in your industry between knowledge about growing apples in the central part of the state and where a lot of the cider producers are kind of focusing their businesses where the people are, where the population is, where some of the existing wine trails are. Okay, just a touch on New York's industry. We like to say we had more cider producers than any other state. Got a little contentious with a few states, so we're not sure where we're at. We know we have a lot. I know in 2021, I think we were #1, but hey, whatever. It's just kind of like a fun fact, and really looking to see everybody continue to grow their businesses and grow their industries over time. But we have about 125 producers in the state, everything from ultra small scale, people fermenting in cubes or plastic juice barrels, all the way up to Angry Orchard has their research and development facility in the Hudson Valley. And of course, they're the #1 producer. It's not where Angry Orchard makes their main cider, the 12-pack style ciders. They're Angry Orchard traditional. They do a lot more craft sort of production there, using bittersweet, bitter sharp apples, red fleshed apples. And the idea is that it's a tourism location, but it's also an R&D location where they're developing new products that they could try to scale up for the national market. And then they also have about 45 acres or so of orchards. And we do a lot of research with them on that site to try to learn about different practices. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So just some of the other stats. I think, it's interesting. I think this is kind of similar to what I saw out for you guys. A lot of farm-based businesses. So people are vertically integrated, growing the fruit, doing estate types of ciders, that kind of thing. So, and we had a big boom in planting around 2020. At one point, the nurseries were producing just a lot of apple trees for the industry. That's really kind of tailed off. This year, 2024, is really interesting one. just to kind of look at, and it'll be interesting to see when some of the data comes in. But a lot of those people who planted orchards over the last 5, 6, 7 years, they're coming into bearing now. And so where I think we were really in this seller's market, right? If you had high tannin apples, you could sell them at whatever price you asked for up through last year. And this year we're starting to see people having to put a little bit more effort into selling that kind of fruit if they don't need it for their own production, looking to who wants to buy it. And there's just a lot more of it. So we also had a really good crop year. So those things ebb up and down, as anybody who knows about apples knows. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about my research specifically. There's kind of 5 areas that I'm working in for cider apple production. And they're listed here: cultivar selection, crop load management, nitrogen management, harvest management, and orchard design. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of data slides over each of these 5 topics. But before we dive into that, I'm just going to glance through the chat, and it just looks like people are introducing themselves, which is great. Oh, Emily said that you guys are going to visit Schilling. Do it. I think it's pretty fantastic operation to see what's happening there. And you can't take pictures inside, right? So the only way to see it is to actually go there.
I'll watch the chat for you too, so I'll let you know if there's any urgent questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, click back to the main screen here. So traditionally in Europe, this is a picture from England, we had cider apples being grown in these very widely spaced, low density sorts of systems, maybe even grazing animals underneath, in this case sheep, but they could also be cattle. What our growers here in New York really wanted higher density systems. So this is one of our trial plantings in our Lansing orchard. This is Cayuga Lake, one of the Finger Lakes. You can see a little sliver of behind me there. This one is 4.5 feet by 15 feet wide. The idea being that we don't have to go as high density as the culinary guys do, but there's a lot of advantage in terms of light interception, efficiency of having these more narrow, more trees per acre, trees planted more closely together, and using trellis. It's more intensive, it's more expensive to plant, of course, but the numbers still scratch out. We keep running economic analyses, we keep doing that work that I mentioned before, and it still comes out in favor of doing higher density plantings. That's not to say that we're not also looking at some other types of systems, and we actually just submitted a grant to look at grazing practices in orchards, in cider apple orchards, to see if we can do that. Because I know a lot of our producers are really interested in that, and they, want that for regenerative agriculture or multiple revenue streams, or just the aesthetics, and they think it's a part of their agritourism package is to have animals around. People love to come and see animals. In the UK, what they're growing there for their cider industry is primarily Dabinet with a little bit of Michelin, and then the rest of it kind of made up of other varieties, including varieties out of the breeding program that they had at the Long Ashton station. They referred to those as the girls, the Long Ashton varieties, and they were crosses between a high tannin apple, Dabinet being one, and the juice apple. And they had 4 different parents that they combined in different ways. And so we actually just got those through our quarantine process here in the States. They're being propagated in a nursery right now. We're hoping to have our first test plantings go into the ground this coming spring of these Long Ashton varieties. But these other ones are mixed. For us, Dabinet, it's okay once we get it established. It gets a lot of winter injury during the establishment or even in the nursery. And Michelin to us, it doesn't really add that much to cider. It has a little bit of tannin, but not enough to really justify the cost of planting it, in my opinion. And so kind of learning about what other industries are doing and trying to figure out what to do. Carol and I did some survey work back in 2014, 2015. And this is a list, I'm not going to read through them all, of what was being grown around the US. That list is pretty much there now, a lot of these varieties, but I think a lot of the nurseries and a lot of the growers are really hoping to try to narrow this down. There's strength in diversity in some sense, right? You get some climatic resilience by having different bloom dates or different harvest dates or different disease resistances, but also makes orchard management, especially at any scale, incredibly difficult. We're also lucky here in Ithaca that I'm close to the USDA's apple collection. They have a living library of over 7,500 different types of apples. So that'd be Malus domestica, which is our culinary apple, and most of our cider apples are domestica, but also there's about 25 different species of apples. And then there's a lot of hybrids. So we've been chemically analyzing these as well as genetically characterizing them to try to figure out what in that collection could possibly be used for cider in our region or elsewhere too. So this is just looking at some of the key chemical properties of titratable acidity and phenolics on the y-axis, the vertical axis here, and just kind of mapping out on this. You can see these are the sweets, the sharps, the bitter sweets, and then the bitter sharps here in blue. And you can see a lot of the ones that have a lot of phenolics are these species or hybrids here. That X means that it's a hybrid. Cause is a Malus severcii selection from a collection trip there. You can see a lot of French varieties tend to be bitter sweet, not a lot of acid in the French varieties. A lot of the English varieties tend to have lower acid than the French. The French like their keeving and they like the acid. I'm sorry, they like the tannins for the keeving. And then you can see Gala, for example, and Golden Delicious are over in these corners here. So we have a new postdoc starting in January. I'm super excited. We're going to take a lot of this data, we're putting it into a database, and we're hoping to have a public interface to it so that you guys can go in there. I don't have an example of it, but we have this kind of model that we're working with some bioinformatics people here at Cornell to be able to, you can put in your selection. I want an apple that has, 3.5 grams per liter of phenolics and or of acid and 2 grams per liter of phenolics, and it'll punch out what these varieties are in that. So if kind of a way of doing cultivar selection, data-driven cultivar selection for the cider industry.
What a cool system. Sorry, I missed a slide a couple back. Someone asked if there were dwarf trees. I'm guessing that was when you were showing pictures from your orchard. Yeah.
Yeah, so these are dwarf trees. I'll touch on this again in a little bit. We have a couple different plantings here looking at dwarf to semi-dwarf in different systems. These are semi-dwarf to full-size trees. So these trees here on the bottom with me in the front, this tree we're hoping to be about 15, 16 feet tall, but in a spindle type of system with a strong central leader versus these kind of more open prune trees. Okay, so some of my work also leans into the genetics of these cider cultivars. This is a project I did with one of my former graduate students who's now a professor down at Penn State. And we were trying to figure out which genes in the apple tree control for acidity. And then if we can use that as a predictor for what the acid would be in the apples. And so all of these MAMA, MA, are different dominant or recessive, dominant with the uppercase and recessive with the lowercase, combinations of the alleles. Q8's another marker, and being able to classify them by these different systems. And it worked pretty well. And this is really helpful. This is like not something you would use in your orchard, but this is something that an apple breeder would use. And if you said to them, I want an apple that's going to have this amount of acidity, they can look at the markers and have a pretty good handle on what kind of acidity is going to be in that apple. So that's something that colleagues at the USDA are now using to do some breeding work for cider apples. Oh, here's the selection tool that I talked about for the database. where you can look at some of the different tools that we'll have. And this is kind of in the middle here is the graphical filtering tool. You can slide this blue box around and it'll spit out these varieties here, like on the right-hand side here. And then we have thumbnail pictures and full-size pictures. So look for that. Hopefully 2026, if we get all the pieces in order. These things take time, and to get all the details right takes a lot of time. We've done a lot of field work too with these, trying to just grow as many varieties as we can afford to do. As you all know, it's expensive. So we've had a number of different cultivar variety trials over time. This is just one that we did with, you can see the list of varieties here, kind of some of the more well-known English, a couple French cider varieties in here that we are looking at, again, looking at titratable acidity and then phenolics on this, just to characterize them. But we also, in this paper here, which is a free paper download, you can go there and learn about the horticultural qualities of these varieties as well. We describe all that. One thing I do in my research program is, in academia, one of our issues is that we have to publish our work in peer-reviewed journals, and a lot of those are really expensive. It used to be that they were almost entirely behind paywalls, but last decade or so, things have moved towards open access journals, but those open access journals charge the author. So for example, I pay anywhere from like $2,500 to $5,000 to publish an article so that it could be available for free. And I just philosophically believe that's the right way to do it, but these things always have costs. Just some of the Spanish varieties that we're trialing. We just got, we had a batch out, got through quarantine in 2018, and we just got the next batch out, and they're in the nursery right now. There was a lot of interest in Spanish varieties by our industry in New York and probably nationally as well. But these are high acid varieties. Remember that a lot of, especially in Asturias, a lot of the cider that they make is Cider natural. It's a little acidic. They use high acid cultivars, and then they allow for a little bit of oxidation and get a little bit of that vinegar. It's been replicated, or people are trying to make Spanish style cider here in the States. And some people can do a nice job technically, but I tell you, I was in Asturias this summer, and it just tastes different when you go to the cideria and they're pouring the cider and they got the tapas on the bar. Boy, can't recommend that enough. That was just a fabulous experience. We have a lot of our cider producers in New York also doing fruit foraging, which is really interesting. And I kind of shrugged my shoulders at it the first few times. People were like, yeah, just collecting these apples from these random old apple trees and making cider out of it. But over time, as the practice kind of became more commercially important to our industry, started to look into a little bit more. I partnered with a folklorist, Maria Kennedy, who's down at Rutgers, and we have this foraged fruit project now where we're doing interviews with the cider producers who are actually foraging for fruit, and then we're actually bringing the fruit back to our lab and chemically analyzing them, and also having them DNA tested to learn what they are. Are they an actual known variety, or are they a variety that is a true seedling? And so we've got another few months of data processing to really get through all that. But it's become, I'd say it's a moderately important part of our industry now. A lot of our smaller scale producers are, again, looking towards these varieties as opposed to the European varieties as perhaps being more climate resilient, right? These are the ones that have survived in the woods or behind somebody's farmhouse or elsewhere for a long time, and maybe they have just natural disease or insect resilience or climatic resilience that make them more adaptable to our climate. So there's some nurseries here that are propagating these trees for the industry now. It'd be interesting to see where that goes. Okay, so through
That's
all
so
that,
creative. Sorry, I'm just just gonna butt in here and just say that's so fascinating. You're working with a folklorist. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's a really fun project to be able to jump disciplines and kind of learn different scientific tools that people use. And so Maria's really asking questions about what is the motivation, right? Why are you doing this? And what are you hoping to get out of it? And my lab is really interested in what's so unique and special about these apples that you can't get from ones that our commercial growers can grow, right? And so it's a nice pairing of research questions and information. And we have probably about 15 to 20 producers that have, some base their entire business model on foraging. They tend to be fairly small scale producers. And then we have a lot of people who do like a one product line. Most of their apples are coming from commercial orchards or their own orchard, and then they have one product where they use foraged fruit.
I would say that's more than we have here. We have, I think I've heard of one business here that is completely foraged, and then there's a handful of folks who do one line.
Yeah, I think it's that there's a lot more seedling trees in our area, and that's just because of the longer history that we've had Europeans living in New York. And then also I think the climatic conditions here allow for an apple pip, an apple seedling to just start growing randomly in a ditch or in a field. A lot of these are coming out of pastures. So what happened is back in the day, they would have the apple mill at somebody's farm and they would press all the apples, and then the pumice would all go to the cows, and the cows would eat it and poop it out. And then lo and behold, you have a seed in a really nice fertilizer package, and it starts to grow. And then, every now and then one of those makes it without getting chowed on, and that becomes this new seedling tree in the middle of a pasture. And we see that quite a bit in New York. So this is a variety list. This is what we're recommending for New York. And again, this is all going to be recorded, and if anybody has questions about these, but these are the ones that have kind of come out ahead for us in the different categories in terms of what's doing well for us in New York. I would say number one is Porter's Perfection. It's really kind of become the most widely planted cider apple, I'd say, and it's a bitter sharp, both acids and tannins in it. Okay, so we're going to just touch on a few other topics here. This is some more pictures of different cider apple orchards in New York, high density systems, dwarf rootstock, 3 to 4 feet between trees, anywhere from 12 to 15 feet between rows, depending on the planting. I'm recommending people go a little bit wider, 14 to 15 feet, with the idea that if they ever want to mechanize harvest or other things, that extra room really helps. If you have a 12-foot spacing, which is what they do on a lot of culinary apples in our state, it's really hard to get the harvester through. You have very little wiggle room. But you can see a lot of, yeah, go ahead.
Someone asked if anyone's doing similar research on varietals in the Northwest.
Yeah, Carol Miles at WSU has a really nice variety trial, and their website as well has a nice list, and they've done a good job of keeping up and publishing reports every few years about the juice quality from their different varieties. But again, remember, I don't know where you're located, but she's in Mount Vernon, so it's like Puget Sound. It's a very maritime climate. If you're inland, it's going to be very different. I don't know of anybody, I mean, Emily or Laura would have to pipe in if there's anybody at Oregon State. I don't know if anybody's really doing anything.
Yeah, there's a research orchard at Oregon State. There's one at Montana State. And
Yep.
I've heard there's folks in Idaho doing a little bit, but I don't think they have an official orchard that they're maintaining.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there's little bits of research happening. I'd say the longest running is definitely Carol's program. We've worked a little bit with the Montana folks too. So I think that's one of the hard things about varieties, and especially, here I am in Ithaca talking to you guys out there, and our climate is so different. So you could really like the juice quality of a Porter's Perfection, but if it doesn't grow well for you for one reason or another, it's just, it's not the right choice. I'd say we've done that work. Our growers have done the lion's share of this work too, right? Because I think the cider industry at large is just going through a massive variety trial. Maybe not as scientific as I do in my research plantings, but definitely people are trying everything and everywhere. And these things take time. If you think about like the wine grape industry and how long it took to figure out which wine grapes grow best in what region in France. For example, that you grow Pinot Noir in Burgundy and you grow Chardonnay in Burgundy and you don't grow that in Bordeaux and you don't grow that in the South, right? And a lot of trial and error over many, many years. And our cider industry is young and we're still figuring this out. And so I'd say you can go with some tried and trues, but also it's important to keep experimenting for yourself. The same is true. So I talked about scion selection. This is also we're looking at rootstock selection. The Geneva rootstock series, which is a project that is out of the USDA, and Cornell collaborates on this. And so we're using Porter's Perfection, and we're trying to see which rootstocks are good choices for cider production in terms of juice quality, in terms of annual bearing, in terms of disease management. Some of these are very small. The G11 is kind of going to be 11, 12-foot tall tree. 890 is going to be a 15 to 17-foot tall tree. So, right? So everything from dwarf to semi-dwarf that we're looking at here. And then we're also looking at what happens if you, it's a metric here, but what happens if we plant the same variety rootstock at different spacings, right? Do we need to be super high density like the fresh market, or can we space the trees out, have lower input costs at planting, and still get enough of a yield that makes sense for cider apples, right? The economics are a little different. Okay, so I'm going to jump through a couple more data slides here. What we're looking at here is some work that my master's student David Zakalik did, and we were looking at how does the number of apples per tree, TCSA is trunk cross-sectional area, so it's an indicator of how big the tree is. The number of apples per tree on the bottom axis to all these to different metrics on the y-axis. So this one's looking at which ones are more annual, right? Which ones are more likely to return bloom. And we find that if you overcrop the tree, you get up to about 20 fruit per tree for these different varieties, that you get 0 flowers the next year. So if you've grown cider apples, they can be very biennial. So we're trying to dial in, where can we be? Where do we need to be in this area here to make sure that we get return bloom, but also this is the same data set, but looking at different chemical properties of the fruit. Where do we want to dial this in so that we're getting return bloom the next year and we're getting the maximizing the juice quality? So we're kind of settling on this number of 9 fruit per trunk cross-sectional area, which is what these red arrows are on the bottom here. And you can see when you have very low crop load, you have very high juice quality, right? You have the highest phenolics, sugars, acids, pan or yan. It's all at the highest level. But of course, you have very low yields, right? So that doesn't really make sense financially. You got to be over here somewhere between 5 and 10 to start getting enough fruit for having to make enough cider so you can actually stay in business. You get a loss of some of that juice quality, but you don't get so much loss that you've got really flabby cider, right? So we're trying to really hone in on these numbers, and we've run a number of different statistical tools on this to figure it out. But if you let your trees go biennial and you have a year with no crop, you have very few apples with really great juice quality, but then the next year you have a ton of apples with really bad juice quality. And so really it's crop load management is trying to find that balance. We've done some work looking at phenolic development in fruit. one interesting tidbit, I won't go into all the details of this. These are different days after full bloom, and then different phenolic measurements on the y-axis, the vertical up and down axis here. And we find that most of the phenolics are developing very early in the season. And so this is something to think about if you're managing cider apple orchards, is that it's a very different than wine grapes, where you're trying to leave the grapes on the vine for hang time to increase certain quality parameters, including phenolics. You don't get that bump in phenolics late in the season for apples. And so you want to let your apples ripen to maturity, but you're not going to increase your phenolics. You'll increase other things, but it's not about the phenolics. And so there's kind of some ideas out there that that's true, and you got to treat apples like grapes, and no, they're very different fruit. They have different physiology and different biochemistries. So I'm going to skip over that and then talk a little bit about mechanical harvesting. I know Carol Miles does a lot of that. Labor, always an issue, whether it's your own family and friends doing it, or you have to hire workers. We did a cost of production study published a couple of years ago, 2022. And the headline kind of says it all. It's that regardless of the scale of your operation, you can find tools, small driven tools, even there's kind of push mower tools now, up to very large, like garbage truck size tools that can be used for mechanical harvesting. But what we found is that regardless of your scale, if you buy equipment that is suited to your needs, it'll save you money. It's not like a genius sort of paper, but I think it kind of hits home the point of the importance of mechanization, especially when labor is in short supply. I want to talk a bit about nitrogen too. This is really important for the cider makers. Boy, when I first started working in the cider industry over 10 years ago, so many ciders were just had really bad hydrogen sulfide problems. And I think it was a lot of learning curve, a lot of new producers, but it's also the fact that apples have a much lower YAN content, yeast assimilable nitrogen content, than grapes do. And a lot of the recommendations that the cider makers were using were based on wine grapes. So we've gone through a lot of papers. I've worked a lot with Amanda Stewart at Virginia Tech, close colleague, and we've published a lot of papers on the use of nitrogen in cider apples. And so biologically, apples and grapes are very different for this. But then we started asking questions about, well, what can we do to increase the juice yeast assimilable nitrogen, or YAN? And we have done work with nitrogen fertilizers and found that as we increase the rate of nitrogen fertilizer, this is ground applications on the left and foliar applications of urea on the right, we can also increase the juice YAN at harvest. The tree will quickly redistribute that nitrogen into the fruit, and we can get our levels up considerably, depending on how much you add. We've only done this with synthetic forms of nitrogen, but I believe this would also hold true if you're an organic grower and you want to use organic nitrogen forms. If you add enough nitrogen per acre or hectare, you're going to increase your YAN. And so if that's a problem for you at your site, this is something to consider. I'll skip over a couple of things. One of the other importance of we do our ground applications in the spring, and the foliar applications we can do close to harvest. We've done them up to 2 weeks before harvest to have an impact, which means that you could actually measure fruit. If this is a persistent problem for you, you can measure fruit in August, for example, and say, boy, our YAN is really low this year, and put on a urea application in August, and then have higher YAN content at harvest. So this is just showing that this is control low, medium, and high nitrogen rates here. And as we increase the nitrogen input, we also decrease, the green line is our hydrogen sulfide levels considerably, right? So we did nothing, lots of hydrogen sulfide, and then we really reduced that down. This is just an example of our our experimental design with some of our small scale fermentations we do in flasks. And then these are hydrogen sulfide detectors instead of an airlock.
Greg, someone asked, when do you add the N?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. You add it, you can add it up close to harvest. You can apply the foliar nitrogen close to harvest. And so the other positive benefit that we found, we just published this paper earlier this year, graduate student Brittany Cook working on this project. And we found that as we increased that YAN content, a lot of that is amino acids. And we also increased a lot of the positive aromatics in the fruit, in the juice. So you're reducing the hydrogen sulfide, you're increasing the aromatics. So it's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of our cider producers want to be low input, not add as much to their systems. But we also know that we have this intervention available, and there's probably going to be more work on this and trying to find other solutions for organic growers of how to make this work on some of your orchards. But it was a win-win. Okay, so that's kind of the research. Just real quickly, this is just some of our industry partnerships. Our Cider Association, New York Cider Association, we do a lot of work with them. Angry Orchard, I mentioned. Glenwood, which is a nonprofit down in the Hudson Valley, has been really instrumental for our industry. We've done some study tours in Europe. This one was in the UK. We do field tours each summer that the Cornell leads. Angry Orchard makes some ciders out of our apples. This one's the extension out of some of our research fruit, and they're doing now a product that is 100% ground harvested apples to really kind of push that issue with regulators. Teach classes on pomology, my pomology 101 class, a fruit crop physiology class, and then what I want to mention is just a cider production class. And we get about 120 students in my lecture for this class each semester, each spring semester. It's a lot of fun and a great way to get our students engaged with the cider industry. It's kind of entry-level class, like first-year students can take it. And they come for the booze, and we give them science and cider. And it's great. It's a really fun class. That's our lecture hall here. You can see we have tasting set up. Okay, and then there's just a lot of other people that I work with at Cornell, and I just don't want to go without mentioning them. Susan Brown, our apple breeder, we're doing some work. A lot of our food scientists and enologists have gotten engaged in cider production over the years. Maybe not as much as they're full part of their program, but they're getting aware, and they're actively working on a project here and there. And then just some of the other aspects of our industry. So I'll just end it there with some pictures, and maybe I'll just going to turn off my slide share and hopefully left myself enough for a few questions here at the end.
You be a shy group, but I just want to say thank you. This is really fascinating. And I know that was mostly an overview of so many things that you've really delved really deeply into. But it's hard to keep up with, all the research that you're doing. And it was really helpful to know that it's out there and we can delve in. Someone did ask, Molly says, can you talk more about TCSA? What does 9 fruit per TCSA look like in practice?
Yeah, it's a bit abstract, isn't it? So it's a metric it's a really good metric. Trunk cross-sectional area is a really good metric for measuring above ground biomass. We do it 30 centimeters from the graft union, and we take a Taylor's tape and we wrap it around the tree. We get the circumference, and then we convert that through geometric conversions to area. And so basically a tree that is, you can see my finger there, that's like 2 centimeters TCSA. So that should have 18 apples, a trunk that big. A trunk that's that big is going to have like about 20 square centimeters, right? And so that's going to have 180 apples. What it works out to be, and we have some on my website. I didn't mention my website, but I have a website. We put a blog post about this. about how to measure this and what this might look like in terms of like how many apples on a branch, right? And every tree is a little different, so it's hard to give that. But the metric that okay, let me think about this. A gala apple tree would have about 6 fruit per trunk cross-sectional. A Honeycrisp tree would have about 4. So we're recommending, 1.5 to 2 times as much as what the culinary apples would do. So there's a lot of fruit on that tree still.
There's a question about nitrogen here.
Mhm.
Are some varieties of apples that are more responsive to the timing of nitrogen applications? And then she also asked, are there other ways a grower can control juice quality?
Yeah, great questions. So far, all the varieties that we've done research on have all responded. We haven't hit upon one that doesn't take up nitrogen the same way or partition it to the fruit in the same way. There are some subtle differences in the amino acid composition of different varieties, and there's kind of like some varieties will make more of one type of amino acid than another, which really isn't that surprising, right? Apples will taste different, look different, and it's not that surprising. They have slightly different concentrations of amino acids, but they all seem to uptake nitrogen about the same rate. So yeah, we'll keep looking at that, but we've done it on 4 different varieties now, and they've all responded. So juice quality, right? So I've mentioned a few things. One is crop load management. I think that's key. I think people really need to start paying more attention to that in the cider orchards, is looking at how many fruit are on the tree. And again, I have a blog post about that on my website, and you can read about that. You'll probably forget about it, but like next April, like go back and look at that. It's up there permanently, so you can go and read through that. And we have some recommendations, but I think that's going to be first and foremost. I think the next thing is good light interception. And this is true across the board for fresh market apples and for cider apples, where it's really important to have canopies that are open and exposed to sunlight. We've published a few papers on this. And so the key is to make sure that you're getting light into the center of the tree. And that's why we're using dwarf trees. There's other ways of doing it with open center trees and different pruning techniques, but that sunlight is essential. And what happens if you don't get sunlight into the middle of the tree is that your canopy keeps getting bigger and bigger on the outside. So you're kind of getting further away from where you want to be able to pick the trees, right? But then the other thing that happens is that the middle of the canopy that's not getting sunlight, you don't get flower buds, because sunlight is critical for flower bud initiation. So those are kind of some of the big things that I would think about.
There's another question here from someone in Idaho, so definitely another different growing region. She says, did you have early fruit drop in your research orchard this year? I am in a similar zone to you, and my English and French varieties dropped about 4 weeks early.
Oof. Yeah, so our drops were moderate this year. Were you in a drought situation, Emily? You can unmute it, or I mean, if you're in a drought situation, that can also really aggravate pre-harvest fruit drop. Any sort of stress on the tree will cause ethylene to be produced in the tree. And ethylene is the hormone, the plant hormone that causes ripening, but it also causes the abscission layer, right? So that point, look, I have a prop. That point on the stem that connects to the branch, right here is your abscission zone. And when you have a little bit of ethylene that gets stimulated in the tree by a stress, so it could be a lot of disease, or it could be a drought, or it could be a nutrient deficiency, can cause that abscission zone to form early. And that's when you get drop. And the abscission zone means that the cells harden. And that's why apples can break, the stem can break easily from the branch. And so that might be what's happening. No drought, but high heat. Yeah, I see that. Okay, so that could be it too. So it could be a heat stress that caused that ethylene. It could have been the crop load. I mean, yeah, I would definitely look at like 4 weeks early is pretty crazy. Was your bloom date in line with previous years, or was your bloom date also early?
Date was
Okay. Oh, bloom date was on time. Okay. Um, yeah.
Emily, you're unmuted, so you can just
Oh.
talk if you want.
You can hear me now. Wow. Great. Yeah, so my bloom date was on time. But we had like a really heavy freeze, but they hadn't bloomed out yet. So I think it was the prolonged heat. But I watered just the same as I always do, and we flood irrigate, so I have a lot of extra water. So
Yeah. A lot of these English and French varieties were selected 100, 200 plus years ago to be grown in orchard systems where, like I showed that picture with the sheep grazing underneath, and the fruit was all in the tree. And then they chose varieties that would drop, would have pre-harvest fruit drop, right? Because they were not picking tree fruit off the tree; they were getting it off the ground. And so I think genetically, some of these cider apples have this kind of natural tendency for pre-harvest drop that is stronger than a lot of our fresh market apples. We did some work, I didn't talk about it today, but we did some work using the plant growth regulators that the fresh market growers use. There's two of them. One is called aminyl vinyl glycine, or AVG. The trade name is Retain. And what it does is it inhibits ethylene from being produced in the tree, and it prevents pre-harvest fruit drop. So if you want your fruit to stay on the tree and you're willing to use a plant growth regulator, that is an option for you. There's another material that is also used, which is an auxin. And our growers call it, we had the apple that we had in our fresh market industry, which is a lot less popular now, that dropped really bad, was Macintosh. And the growers would say always, like, the day before they were going to harvest, the day before would be a windstorm and all their apples were on the ground. So they would use this auxin NAA, and there's a couple different labels out there for it, and it's all registered and legal to use for apples, safe to use. And our growers called it Stop Drop because it works really well, and you can apply that 4 to 7 days before harvest, and that will really help the apple stay on the tree. But if it's a long, prolonged drop issue, I would say Retain is probably the product that's going to work well.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
A couple more questions here. Genevieve says, do you thin the blossoms versus young fruit?
Great question. Yes, we do it all. So the physiology of it is that the earlier that you remove that fruit, the less impact that fruit is going to have on inhibiting flower buds. So what happens is that seeds, apple seeds, produce hormones that inhibit flower bud production. And so this is kind of one of the root causes of biennial bearing, is that when you have a year with a heavy crop load, you have a lot of seeds, and they're producing gibberellins, this plant hormone, naturally. And those gibberellins move up the stem of the branch, and they prevent flower buds from forming for the next year. So then the apple tree is just concentrating all its resources into the apples that it's growing that year, and it's going to sacrifice next year to have a great crop this year. And so this is something just evolutionarily that apple trees have done. There's many other species, even some that are not even very closely related to apple, that follow a similar sort of masting pattern, is what they call it. Pears, yep, can be biennial as well. Yep, absolutely. Citrus, figs, a lot of the nut crops all have this kind of evolutionary adaptation, right? It's concentrating all of your energy into reproduction in 1 year, and then the next year is an off year. You're going to regain your strength and then go for it again. And so that's how we have biennial bearing. So the earlier you remove the potential for fruit, even through pruning off flower buds, but certainly at flowering or at very early fruitlet size, the more positive impact you'll have to remove those seeds to minimize the amount of flower bud initiation that you're going to have, if I said that correctly. So in other words, the sooner you get those seeds off the tree, the better. And if you are thinning fruitlets that are already golf ball size or so, it's probably almost too late for trying to minimize flower bud initiation for the next year. You can reduce the amount of branch breakage that you'll get. You'll probably have a little bit nicer fruit in that given year, but you won't have a big impact on next year's flowering. So if you have the capacity to do flower thinning, and we've done some research on that, and we just don't have time to go into all the nitty gritty of it, but you can send me an email and I can share more resources. But we've used a lot of organic materials for that, lime sulfur primarily for flower thinning. And then the next best time is to do it at fruitlet. But by the time they get to be golf ball size, they're getting to be almost too big.
I'll put your email in the chat here.
Yeah, definitely.
There's one more question, which is relevant, and then we can say goodbye because it's been over an hour. Which varieties have you found are best for annual bearing? And I assume they're talking about cider apples, but.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's another reason why Porter's Perfection has really risen to the top of our list of recommended varieties. Very annual. Bloom date is more in line with a lot of our culinary apples, which is important for us. We have fire blight really bad in our region. And I know it's in parts of the Pacific Northwest, less on the coastal areas, but it's still out there. I saw fire blight. People say, well, there's no fire blight out here. There's fire blight there, guys. Sorry.
Oh yeah. If anyone said it's not here, they're wrong.
It's wrong. I heard it from when I was in Somerset and Herefordshire. They're like, oh, well, we don't really have fire blight. And I looked around, I found it, but what's different is that during bloom, it tends to be cooler in the coastal regions. The closer you are to the ocean, once you get inland over the Cascade, it's hot. It's a different story, but it's cooler during bloom, so you're less likely to have infections, and you're less likely to have the bacteria build up in high populations very quickly. The hotter it is during bloom, the more likely you're going to have infections, and the faster that bacteria multiplies. So I think in the UK they told me the same. Oh, we don't have fire blight. Okay, but then last year, and this is one of the effects of climate change, is that it's global warming too, right? And so our springtime temperatures are getting warmer. And a couple of the growers that I know over there had really bad fire blight outbreaks for the first time ever over the last couple of years in England. Very sad to hear because they lost a lot of trees, but also kind of like, okay, the organism is here. It's just a matter of the right environmental conditions.
So you're saying the Porter's Perfection is pretty good for annual bearing, but is it really susceptible to fire blight? Is that what you're saying?
Every apple that I've encountered is susceptible to one degree or another. So there's no resistance yet. There's a whole lot of researchers working on that, but because of the earlier bloom date, it's less likely to be warm during bloom for Porter's Perfection, and so it's less likely to get infected. So it's not about susceptibility, but less likely to have an infection. Looks like it's a question about, well, so there's a question, when do you expect to have data on your livestock grazing grant? Well, we just put in our pre-application. So if we get approved for that, then we put in a full application and we'd get approved for the grant, knock on wood, this summer. So it's a
2 or
ways
3
out.
years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's going to be a long-term project. It's a really interesting area. There's a few projects in Europe on it, but there's been where a lot of this is really being driven is by the wine grape industry, and particularly in California. And there's a lot of large scale wine grape growers who are very interested in grazing in their vineyards. And they're looking at it for weed control and also suckering, because they can get the sheep to eat the suckers on the, coming out of the ground.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here, Greg, for sharing all your knowledge. We hope to see you soon, maybe at CiderCon. But we will end the recording here and say goodbye. Thanks, guys.